Hey, y'all. Good evening and welcome. My name is Caroline Bradley, and I'm Richland Library Northeast Kitchen Program Coordinator. We want to welcome you to tonight's program, Meet the Authors with Chef Kevin Mitchell and historian David Shields. Now, before our author discussion gets underway, I wanted to share an incredible resource that is available in our community. I am sitting in our state-of-the-art teaching kitchen at our Northeast location, which was completed 2 years ago following renovations. Now, this space provides the opportunity for customers to learn about nutrition, cuisine, food safety, and different cooking techniques. Now, we look forward to having chefs, entrepreneurs, and cooking enthusiasts back in the space as soon as it is safe to do so. And we're also looking forward to an exciting 2022 with virtual cooking programs that will cater to the foodie spirit in you. Now, look forward to our virtual cooking programs with topics ranging from culinary technique to international cuisine and regional cuisine using seasonal ingredients. You will find those programs and other free programs at richlandlibrary.com. So in the meantime, we are excited to offer you programs tonight just like this one. So y'all, I am so excited for tonight's program. And since I'm from Charleston, reading their book was like reading a history of all the food that is significant for me being raised in the South. Now, growing up, many of these culturally significant dishes were on my table, whether it was made by my mother or grandmother, and soon they will be on your table. Now, don't forget to buy your signed copies with the local independent bookseller, Odd Bird Books. Moderating our conversation with Chef Kevin Mitchell and Professor David Shields is Eva Moore, Communications Director for South Carolina Department of Agriculture. Eva Moore has been in that role since 2019, and before that, she spent a decade at Free Times, Columbia's alt-weekly newspaper, as its food writer, city reporter, and editor. Again, thank you all so much for spending your evening with us, and it is my pleasure to introduce food influencer, Eva Moore.
Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to be here working with my public library and with two folks who have written a really world-class book. Let me first introduce Kevin Mitchell, who is the first African-American chef instructor at the Culinary Institute of Charleston. Chef Mitchell has culinary arts degrees from the Culinary Institute of America and a master's degree in Southern Studies from the University of Mississippi. He studied Southern foodways, preserving Southern ingredients, and the history of African Americans in the culinary arts there. He is also a South Carolina Chef Ambassador for 2020 and 2021. This is a program that's run jointly by my department, the State Department of Agriculture, and the South Carolina Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism to highlight South Carolina's foodways, its agriculture, and its destinations. Chef Kevin was the first chef in that program who wasn't tied to a restaurant, which is a sign, I think, of how much we wanted him on board. And it's really been a delight to see him at work these past 2 years, teaching and mentoring other chefs and just cooking some phenomenal food. Yes, so thank you, Chef Kevin.
Thank you.
Yeah. Dr. David Shields is Carolina Distinguished Professor in the English Language and Literature Department at the University of South Carolina. He's a man of varied research interests over the years, but his food scholarship specifically involves not just a lot of research and writing, but extensive boots on the ground work to find and restore heirloom crops. He's the chair of the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation. He received a few years ago the Southern Foodways Alliance's Ruth Fertel Keeper of the Flame Award, which is focused on unsung heroes, like on highlighting the people who are putting in the work behind the scenes. So we're very fortunate to have him here as well. And I will turn it over now to David and Kevin.
Thank you so much for inviting us. We have a little presentation that we have, and I'll boot that up right now. We're promoting here or taking a look at a book that came out in October called Taste the State, South Carolina's signature foods, recipes, and their stories. And there are 82 entries in this book, which reflect particularly the the specific history of the food, both the ingredients, the things grown in the field, and the dishes, the things created by household cooks, enslaved African cooks, restaurateurs, professional caterers, and home cooks today. And Kevin can tell you a little about the process of how we decided on those 82 ingredients.
Well, the 82 ingredients actually came from a list of well over 100. When David first asked me to get together with him to write this book, he explained to me what he hoped and what he wanted this book to be about. So we sat down and just chronicled a list of ingredients and dishes that have historic ties to the state of South Carolina. And we wanted to be very cognizant of those ingredients and our dishes that were not from South Carolina, which we learned much soon after we announced the fact that we were writing this book was probably not a good thing to do in some people's eyes. So we had this list of about 100, I believe 104, 105, once again, ingredients and or dishes. And we decided to basically kind of tackle this list basically by David saying, well, Kevin, I want you to pick the specific ingredients and or dishes that you would be most interested in researching and writing about. And then David would choose the ones that he was most interested in writing about. And any ones that were left over, we would kind of tag team those to make sure that those were done. So most people know David and I met back in 2013. And it's kind of how our friendship and working relationship started when Charleston hosted the Rice Symposium by the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation, where I was to create or do a demo on chicken bog. And soon after, we crossed paths again when Charleston hosted the American Culinary Federation's Southeast Regional Conference. And there, David introduced me to the story of Nat Fuller. Nat Fuller was one of the most important Black caterers from the city of Charleston in the late 1800s. And he's telling me the story of how at the end of the Civil War, he hosted this dinner where Blacks and whites got together and broke bread in the spirit of equality and in the spirit of reconciliation. And I tell people this all the time, and David knows that initially, I didn't think this was going to happen. It was just a conversation. And I soon learned that within 2 weeks from that initial conversation, David inundated my email with any and every possible fact I could ever possibly want to learn and know about Nat Fuller. So we went about recreating this dinner that he held in 1865, and we recreated that dinner in 2015. 2016, I left the state of South Carolina to pursue my master's degree at the University of Mississippi. And David and I, of course, kept in close contact during those 2 years of me getting that graduate degree. And when I moved back to Charleston, late 2018, early 2019, he approaches me with, hey, let's write this book. And that's how the book comes about. The list was a list that we had put together basically in sitting in my office here in Charleston at the Culinary Institute of Charleston. And then we went about writing the book. And you can see we went from 104 or so to 82. And that was definitely based on the fact that we had well surpassed our contracted word count from the press. So writing this book was also a really great learning experience for me to understand how how books actually come to life.
Now, one of the things that you have to say about trimming those 20 extra entries that we had written was that we had included a number of things which were sort of generically Southern, things like potato salad and coleslaw, and ingredients that were certainly important to South Carolina, but couldn't in any way just be viewed as a signature, such as Madeira, the favorite wine of the early 19th century and an ingredient in so many of the recipes. Then we had a category of ingredients like fried chicken and pecan pie that actually have stronger claims to other states. Historically, Virginia has been tied to the genesis of fried chicken, and any Texan will tell you that the pecan pie is a creation of the great state of Texas, first appearing in the 1880s there, and any Southerner who's trying to appropriate it is engaged in a violation of the sovereignty of that great state. So that's why there's no pecan pie recipe, but we did include pecans because at one time at Boone Hall Plantation, the largest pecan grove in the world existed. And many of the pecan confections of the 20th century were supplied. The confectioners all along the East Coast that created sugared pecans and various types of pecan treats were supplied by that plantation. There was one extraordinarily controversial elimination, and Kevin will tell you about that.
So in the writing of the book, when David and I first got together to decide what was going to stay, what was going to go, David he made a post on Facebook officially announcing the fact that he and I were going to write this book about these signature foods that come from South Carolina. And he included the list of all the things we were going to write about in this post. And then we asked the public to chime in and to give us suggestions for things that they felt we should write about on top of the things that we had already proposed writing about. And the number one ingredient dish that people were so upset about that we were not including in that list was pimento cheese. Pimento cheese is not from South Carolina. South Carolina can claim the introduction of the pimento burger, I believe, in Colombia. Yes. However,
that's right.
However, pimento cheese is a dish. Also, the pimento pepper is a product of the state of Georgia. The specific pepper would have been the perfection pimento that was exclusively born in or grown in Georgia, excuse me, where the creation of pimento cheese comes from. So even still, after explaining many, many times to people why pimento cheese is not in the book, we still get people very upset over pimento cheese. But once again, we can claim the pimento burger. So I think we can go halfway on it and not necessarily exclude pimento cheese. But of course, you see, we didn't write about the pimento burger either. So
right. If the truth were told, the very first citation of pimento cheese as a culinary creation comes from New York in this, I guess, the third quarter of the 19th century. So it isn't even created in the South in its original form. And the same could be said about iced tea, which exists in various forms before it comes south, and it's first sighted in the South in 1867. But I felt we had to include sweet tea in the story of South Carolina because there is a large proportion of the population that can't operate without a regular infusion of it. And that sugary kick is up there with coffee as the driver in many people's lives. So we had to include iced tea. You'll see a number of ingredients on the cover of this book. There's that pecan. We talked about it. And you see down on the bottom a peach. Well, everyone calls Georgia the peach state, but I'm sure many of the people in our audience know that it's actually South Carolina that produces substantially more peaches than Georgia does. And that particular peach that you see is the lemon cling peach, which first came in the 18th century to Charleston, then moved up to New York and was sold nationally in the 18 teens. Thomas Jefferson grew it in Monticello, went out to the West Coast and became California's favorite canning peach in the early 20th century. If you opened up a can of canned peaches, that's what you got. And then, as many heirloom ingredients experienced in the last half of the 20th century, modern, more productive varieties were created by plant breeders. And this wonderful peach that used to be everywhere now is virtually nowhere. And one of the great acts that Slow Food in South Carolina has done, the Charleston branch, was to restore this peach to cultivation in the state. And now in various places across the state, saplings of the lemon cling peach, the original peach for brandied peaches and peach brandy, is being grown once again on our grounds. Kevin, you're a man who's cooked a lot of Carolina Gold rice in your time. Perhaps you want to talk about the centrality of rice in South Carolina cookery.
Yes, so many people know that I am not from South Carolina. So I can tell you that my first experience with dealing with Carolina Gold rice was at that rice symposium that we hosted here in 2014, I believe it was, where once again I was asked to do a cooking demo on chicken bog. And when I first was asked to do this demo, my first question to myself was, what is chicken bog and why do they call it bog? And I reached out to David and via email, and he explained it to me that the dish, it's called that because the rice, once it's cooked, it gets bogged down by the cooking liquid that you use to make the dish. And of course, using Carolina Gold rice is central to making this dish. But this particular ingredient is central to the Charleston area because it was the rice that was grown here prevalently through the state, specifically in this area, cultivated by the African American up until the Civil War, or the end of the Civil War, which basically wiped out all the Carolina Gold rice crops in the state. But it is very central to South Carolina cooking, the cooking of African Americans, because it does come from it does come from Africa. And those dishes that we cook here with that rice, purlus, which we write about in the book, which would be those one pot rice dishes, which also include other ingredients. Could be vegetables, it could be chicken, it could be, of course, seafood, things like oysters and shrimp, okra. We actually even have a recipe for an egg purlu, right? So those dishes being central to Africa, being brought here in this area was the most important ingredient I think we had to include in the book. And if you go through the book, you see it does take up some real estate in the book. It's probably our longest entry in the book because we include so many different recipes of these purlus. And one in particular would be red rice, which is a derivative of a dish that comes to us from Africa. It can either be from Nigeria or other places in Africa called jollof, which is a rice dish that, of course, contains rice, but does have to have some type of tomato product. So from jollof or even thebujen, which is also from that area, coming and transplanting itself here in this area. So in this particular entry, you'll see this one recipe here is just how to boil rice. And rice cooking in this area was the key to becoming the most experienced and the most well-liked cook in the area. If you did not know how to make rice, a plain pot of rice, you were not considered a good cook at all.
One of the things about rice, what Kevin said about the Civil War leading to the decline in Carolina gold, it actually has a sort of long death from the 1870s to about World War I, when the last large commercial plantations finally shut down. But private people still were growing it in the Combahee up until the 1920s, but you couldn't buy it at a grocery store after maybe around 1909 or 1910. So you had this problem of having all of these classic purlus and rice recipes and not having the proper rice to go with it. One of the things that happens at the end of the 20th century is that the great restaurateur Alice Waters decides that American cooking should focus on ingredients and not on French sauces. And so the restaurateurs in Charleston decide to go out to their local farmers and start using ingredients. And the oldest generation of diners says the flavor's wrong. And in fact, there's no flavor there. The restaurateurs, sort of tearing their hair out. What's the problem? Well, it turns out that the actual ingredients that were used, the Carolina gold rice, the Sea Island red peas, the purple ribbon sugarcane, those things that made up the original South Carolina cookery had been supplanted by more agronomic crops. And there were only 3 crops that sort of survived from the earlier era. And that was okra and collards and mulberries to a certain extent. So that's what caused the beginning of the restoration of all of the Southern ingredients. That's why the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation was formed, and the revival of South Carolina's greatest creations took place over this last 15 years, leading to the Renaissance in Southern cooking. It's an ingredient-driven revival. And chefs all across the South will tell you that the ingredients that were brought back are essential to the quality of the food that's made by professionals in the South today. South Carolina was a driver in that revival. The plant that you see on your left is Benne, or the sesame plant, one of the African diaspora plants. On your right, you see a calabash filled with Benne seed. Now, we know Benne seed basically from a candy these days, Benne wafers, but Benne was an important ingredient in a whole range of cooking. And Kevin is much experienced in this and has thought about it long. So why don't you tell them about the depths of Benne cookery?
So Benne seeds, will have to say it's probably one of my favorite ingredients to use. I use it a lot in the house, much to the chagrin of my family members who don't want to see Benne seeds every day in their meal. But this is a very important ingredient because these are true sesame seeds that come to us from Africa. You can see in the picture that they do not in any way, as far as the color, represent sesame seeds that we know of today when you go to in a Chinese or Asian restaurant that serves sesame seeds. You can see they're a lot darker. Very important crop, mainly because of its many different uses. It can be parsed, squeezed into oil, which at one point was the main cooking medium in this area in 17 going into the 1800s. And unfortunately, of course, with the onset of lesser produced oils, the using these seeds to produce oil basically kind of went to the wayside. And fortunately, with people like Glenn Roberts of Anson Mills, who is producing these seeds, he is actually making oil. Also very important because the enslaved African would use this in other ways, not only by getting the oil from it, but they would ground it into a flour, which could be used in baking. It could also be ground into a flour and folded into a hearty pot of collard greens to make up for the lack of protein, or specifically a smoked protein product, which would be either a smoked pigtail or ham hock or things like that, because it has that unctuous flavor that kind of gives you that sensation of having a smoked pork product. They were used in that way a lot of times because many plantations did not always have access to hogs. So they had to find ways or different ways of using this product. Now, I actually have a bag of Benne seed flour that I've worked with. I also have some Benne seed oil and the seeds in my freezer directly from Anson Mills. But what we know, like David said, the most important dish that comes would be the Benne seed wafer. But we do know that Benne seed wafers that are produced today do not, and I'm going to say it again, do not contain true Benne seeds. They contain sesame seeds. So when you go down the market and you buy that bag of Benne seed wafers, take a look at those wafers and go back to this picture and see the color of these seeds compared to the color of the seeds that they use in those wafers.
The Benne is interesting too. in early cookery in South Carolina, every plant had to have multiple uses, and there's a pharmacology associated with this plant. The greatest anti-irritant for your digestive tract, the thing that you would give to children who had an upset tummy, was the leaves of the sesame plant put into water would create this mucilage, which was cooling and would coat the interior of your gastric system. And it was better than Pepto. So you're looking at a plant that had many uses. And nowadays, if you're interested in getting Benne oil, there's actually a place called Oliver Farm in Pitts, Georgia, that will sell it to you online. And it's one of the most wonderful South Carolina ingredients.
This is a photo of Catfish Stew. This is a recipe that has been updated by myself. It does have catfish. It does have the main ingredients, of course, catfish, okra. I do add corn. I do add crab to it, served next to a bowl of Carolina Gold rice. This is one of the photos that is included in the book. This photo was taken here at my home by my fiance, who has really great camera skills. This photo comes about because we were not able to get a photographer through the pandemic, and the thing was, well, Kevin, you're a chef. You can cook some of these items at home and take photos because you have really great photos on your Instagram. However, I had to be honest and tell them that those photos were not mine. They belonged to Rhonda, who would take the photos. I would take them and then put them on my page as if I took those photos. So she was able to add several photos to the book. I believe there's 9 photos of things that we prepared here at the house that she took, all on her really great Google Pixel phone.
One of the things about this is that there are actually 2 camps of catfish stew in this state. You have the low country white catfish stew, and you have the Midlands upcountry red catfish stew. And you can see that that Kevin has gone away from his low country locale and honored the culinary tastes of the Sand Hills and the Dutch Fork and Columbia. So gaze on that, Colombians, and revel in the splendor of your native food.
That would actually be an amazing opportunity for me to ask a question if I can hop into the discussion for the
Sure.
remaining moderated part here. So yeah, besides red catfish stew, since we're here in the Midlands region, can you talk a little bit about some of the foods in your book that specifically characterize the Midlands and how you work to make sure you were representing foods from all across the state?
Yeah, we'd be glad to. There are a number of them. One of the things that this area is famous for are watermelons. There's a crescent that goes from Sumter, South Carolina to Augusta. That was the center of watermelon breeding in 19th century America. And the Bradford watermelon is perhaps the most famous one. But when you think about watermelon, you think about all those other things like watermelon rind pickle, which is, a classic Midlands dish. Watermelon molasses, which was used as a form of confection, and watermelon brandy, which was made by some of the distillers here before Prohibition took hold. So the watermelon is one of those things. And from Sumter, too, there's a famous red chicken stew, which we have a recipe for. The Dutch fork has its own sort of dramatically inflected things, and Dutch fork pumpkin, which Kevin has worked with pretty extensively. You want to say a few words about the culinary qualities of that pumpkin?
Well, it's a beautiful pumpkin. I mean, it's a beautiful pumpkin to work with. The flavor is phenomenal. I've made soup with it. One of the really great things about this pumpkin is that it lasts for a very long time. As long as there's no punctures to it, it will stay fresh for an extremely long period of time. And there is a gentleman, actually Nat Bradford from Bradford Watermelon, who is producing those pumpkins. And actually, I'm probably going to purchase some from him next week for a pumpkin soup I'm probably going to make next week. But if you have an opportunity, you can go to Nat Bradford's website, and he will sell them to you. He also has his watermelon, and then the one ingredient we did talk about that was on the cover, he does some really great collards and okra as well.
One of the things about pumpkins is that while pumpkin pies were made in South Carolina, the much more popular thing that was created were called pumpkin chips, which were preserved, almost translucent slices of pumpkin. And every old recipe collection and manuscript has a recipe for pumpkin chips. Now, I haven't actually tasted one. And one of the reasons we reproduced some of the old recipes in this book was in the hope that someone would be inspired to revive certain of the dishes that have become passé or have been supplanted in the tastes of citizens. And this certainly is one of them.
Those all sound like things that I think are either familiar enough to Midlands people or sound delicious. But
crackling bread too is one of the things that you get here in the Midlands. That cracklings are the little, when you're rending hog lard, there are these little condensations that form, and they're crunchy and they're fried. And you can actually buy bags of cracklings these days from a supplier down in Louisiana if you don't have a lard kettle in your backyard. But this was actually the season that hogs were rendered. This section of December was the time, and processing hogs for barbecue or whatever right around now.
Can you talk about maybe some of the things that would seem more alien to us now that are in your book, like areas where you've noticed tastes have changed significantly and our sensibilities have changed? I have one chapter in mind, but I bet you have some as well.
Well, I can tell you there were a couple that were alien to me that I did not believe had any connection to the state of South Carolina. And the first one for me is actually the first one we write about in the book, which would have been asparagus. When David first had the list, I'm looking at it and I said, David, why are we writing about asparagus? As a chef, someone who's gone to culinary school where you're taught French culinary techniques, when you deal with asparagus, you're dealing with steamed asparagus with that beautiful hollandaise sauce, which is as French as it can be. So for me, why would I think asparagus would be local or central to South Carolina? But then through research, we find out that South Carolina was the king growing state of asparagus many, many years ago. Very popular. Even the asparagus that was grown here would actually get shipped to the north, and chefs would use that asparagus in the north. There is one place that we know of that still grows or cultivates that specific variety of asparagus. The Palmetto asparagus is at Monetta Farms in Monetta, South Carolina. I haven't been able to get my hands on it yet, but I'm hoping to at some point get some and make some here at home, maybe with a little bit of hollandaise sauce on it.
Right. The Tanya is one of the old vegetables of South Carolina. This is the corm or root of the elephant ear plant. And at one juncture, it was a favorite breakfast food. They boiled it, they roasted it, they baked it. Now the elephant ear is basically an ornamental, and they don't realize that this is a savory root vegetable that was part of the regular cuisine of 19th century South Carolinians. And to this day, down in the West Indies, you will go to a market in Trinidad and you'll see the Tanya root, all of the sweet potatoes. You'll see the taro root. You'll see the dasheen, the little eddos. There's a whole world of roots that were one time eaten throughout the coastal South, and they still eaten in the West Indies. The Tanya was the most popular of those to have disappeared.
I'll probably ask one more question and then we'll start taking some from the audience. I want to ask, it seems like there's a lot of attention, much deserved, on South Carolina food right now. Like there's your book, there's Netflix's High on the Hog, Padma Lakshmi's Taste the Nation, Cartier Brown's ongoing success. Like it seems like a lot of eyes are on us right now, and a lot of people are learning about the Gullah Geechee traditions and the African roots of low country food. What do you hope is going to come about all that attention? Like, how do you think we as a state should be moving forward, given that this is a little bit of our moment?
I think that there are dimensions of our traditional food that have not been developed to the extent that they should be. Certain of the ingredients that were once traditional have passed into semi-neglect, and they should be available again because they're all beautiful flavors. But I have to say this, South Carolina has more consciousness than many, if not most, other states about their cuisine. And people have been keeping, whether it's at the holidays or when families get together, and they have certain dishes that are part of their ceremonial that are tied to their place, their family, and their sense of what life is. I think the most interesting recent development that's taken place is the consciousness among the Native American peoples in South Carolina and North Carolina too, about their growing heritage and the desire to get back once again the maize varieties, the squash varieties, the bean varieties that they grew. One of the wonderful things that's happened in the past 3 years was that the Catawba have gotten their wonderful flour corn back, and George Warren de Leslin's growing it out near Rock Hill. The Lumbee have gotten their corn varieties back, the Waccamaw Siouan. It's a good thing when every community, every group within a state that has a traditional food knows what it is and has it at its disposal.
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited about all eyes on Southern food, and specifically all eyes on South Carolina food. And as it relates to the Gullah Geechee culture, which is of course prevalent in this area here, You know, to me, it's the truest, rarest form of cuisine that we have. And it's extremely important that, you know, people like David and I and other people who are doing this work, that we continue to push this forward. We continue to get this research, get this information out to people, and to inspire people from those different communities here in this area and throughout the state to bring back these foods, bring back these ingredients. You have to, for me as a chef, you have to understand the ingredient. You have to know the history of the ingredient in order to get people to understand why the ingredient or why this dish is important and why it should never become extinct. Right? And you can see here, this slide, this woman is on market and she's holding a tray of different types of candies. And there's one particular candy on here that seems to have become extinct. And that is the groundnut cake. And it's basically peanuts, molasses. There's some recipes that do call for brandy. And this ingredient or this dish becomes extinct mainly because of the fact that it attracted flies. So you see this woman in her hand, she's holding a fly swatter. So the sugar, of course, in these candies attracted so many flies that it became, it was outlawed for people to actually sell these candies in the market. And so I feel that with that outlawing of this dish, it discouraged people from even making it at home. So as David said, we hope to inspire people to bring some of these things back, and shine a light on what Southern cuisine is all about.
That actually dovetails perfectly to an audience question, which is someone asking, basically says, I'm curious about the way heirloom foods are brought back. Where do you find the seeds if they haven't been on the market for decades, if not longer? Are there private collections or something like that?
Well, I guess I should answer this since this is what I've been doing for 15 years or so. In order to find something, you have to know that it's lost. And one of the things that we did in South Carolina that virtually no one else did anywhere in the South was that we did research, years of research into the food to learn what the important things were that made up the growing systems in the early 19th, later 19th, early 20th centuries. We had a list. And when you have a list and you have descriptions and you even have photographs, you have a lot of information to go out and search with. It's like a missing persons search where you've got the photograph and a great description of how a person behaves and where they go to. So the other thing that you can count on is that if something is truly the finest tasting form of a corn or a strawberry or something else that exists, somewhere, somebody in the South, an old believer, has still got it, has still growing it in their backyard. Just a month ago, a 99-year-old guardian of a variety of corn called Cox Prolific, his name was Manning Farmer, lived up in Landrum, died. He was the single grower of this most important field corn from the 19th century. He grew it since the late 1940s. He got it from his uncle, who bought it from the Hastings Seed Company in the early 1930s. By the 1980s, he was the last person in America growing it. In 2017, me and a woman named Angie Lavezzo visited him in Landrum. We saw the corn. We notified people of its existence. We put it in seed banks. We put it in the hands of millers like Greg Johnsman of Marshen. It's also being grown up by Colonial Milling. And now it's being grown from Maine to Arizona. It was only grown by one person, but we made sure that now it's a general resource. And this is the kind of story that that is repeated 40 some times. Of the 45 ingredients that the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation came up with in 2006, we've got 41 of them. We found them. They were all virtually extinct except 3 when we started out. But people like Nat Bradford surfaced with his heirloom watermelon, and we found a man in Mississippi growing the purple ribbon sugarcane, and one by one they come on in, except for 2 varieties of strawberries and a variety of rye.
Maybe someone here can help you find that.
I hope.
Yeah, someone listening. All right, so here's another audience question. If you could add 3 more entries into the book, what would they be? What did you leave behind that you wish you hadn't?
We left behind, well, we mentioned a couple earlier on, Madeira.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, more selfishly, because I'm a huge fan of Madeira, it does have a great history tied to South Carolina and the South. And also Madeira, because when we think about beverages in this area, we always tend to lean towards bourbon, which I'm a huge fan of as well. But Madeira, David mentioned potato salad. What about you, David?
Mulberries.
Mulberries.
Yeah, dried mulberries were a fruit that were cherished by people. Gullah Geechee mulberry wine is still prepared along the coast if you happen to know the proper person. And the greatest mulberry breeder of the 19th century was living in Colombia, Nicholas Herbemont. I'd also put the Herbemont grape, the first wine grape that produced regular vintages in the United States in the 18 teens, and was the grape whose rootstock helped save the French vineyards in the 1860s when phylloxera hit. So Herbemont grape, mulberries. There are a lot of apples, like the Hoover apple, that we could stick on. But let's face it, when it comes to apples, there are a lot of other states that have a heftier claim to being apple states than South Carolina.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to take an agricultural question here because that's close to my heart. Someone is asking, from your perspective, is there a market for beginning farmers focusing on the cultivation of heirloom, landrace, ancestral type foods?
Well, the answer is you better believe it is. Whether it's growing heirloom corn for distillers or extraordinary vegetables like the Charleston Wakefield cabbage, which is the finest coleslaw cabbage known to humankind, and an interestingly shaped cabbage that was once grown in enormous quantities in this state. There's a a premium for these vegetables that make them more attractive to beginning and middling farmers than growing commodity crops. And the problem with growing soy and corn is that maybe a farmer in the Ukraine is going to drive the price of that corn so low on the world market that your farm can't go into the black because they can't get a good return price. So the question is, what sorts of things can you find you have to be creative these days to think about what will be the items that command money. I think the hibiscus, the demand is not being met in the United States. It's all being imported. So why don't you grow that?
Right. Okay, here's a very specific question. What is the difference between Frogmore, Camp, and Brunswick stews?
The first thing I can tell you, it depends on who's making it and where they're from. If they're Frogmore, Brunswick Stew tend to be the same thing, but you gotta, if you're from if you're from Frogmore County, it's Frogmore Stew. If you're from other parts, but Brunswick, Frogmore, basically it's, seafood, right? And then you have, depending on where you're from, you have the addition of some ingredients or the omission of some ingredients. But it's also like,
what do you think? It's sausage and corn is the other ingredients that have to be in Frogmore?
yes. And it's also like, this is something somewhat similar, but people say, well, what's the difference between Country Captain made in South Carolina and Country Captain made in Savannah? Well, once again, it depends on who's saying it and where they're from. They're from Savannah, then they claim Country Captain. They're from Charleston, they claim Country Captain. So it just, once again, where you're from and how you grew up.
Yeah, the Brunswick stew question is an interesting one because you got the Virginia Brunswick stew people on the hardcore, so you got to have squirrel in that. And you got the Brunswick, Georgia people insisting, no, you got to have chicken, and the protein's different. So,
yep.
And people have devoted books to which Brunswick has the authentic claim to Brunswick stew. I always thought it was the Virginians, but you can't say that south of the Savannah River. But camp stew is different too, because that's much more rough and ready. It's what's available. The one thing that I've had in camp stew that, it's like whatever root vegetable you can find, whether it's a potato or a sweet potato or a carrot. I've never had a beet, but, it's sort of like a collection. One of the things that's sort of similar is like pine bark stew, which is a stew which is flavored with ketchup and Worcestershire sauce, but is composed of freshwater fish. Now, whether you use brim or whether you use catfish and red horse, or a mixture of the above, is all depending on what's biting in your region at the time. But it has to be fresh water. And the other thing is that you have to have bacon fat down at the bottom of your kettle when you're doing it. There's no pine bark actually in pine bark stew. There was this crazy moment in the late 20th century when some people in the PD insisted on sticking a chunk of resin in the stew. No, the pine bark was used as part of the fuel for the kettles. It was quick burning and ignited quickly. So it's the wood, not the contents of the pot.
All right. I'm going to take one more question here. So someone is asking, basically they appreciate your contributions to food history and gastronomy, and they're wondering if they want to become more involved or, help with some of the things you've been talking about today. Are there groups or programs or organizations you'd recommend? How could they get involved?
Kevin, you want to make a recommendation?
I think we can start with Slow Food. Slow Food USA, or based on where you are, you may have a local chapter. They are heavily involved in the restoration of not only Southern ingredients, but ingredients across the world. And I know David has been very influential on getting specific ingredients that have been lost on what they call the Ark of Taste. And the Ark of Taste is this list of these ingredients or dishes that have become extinct or on their way to becoming extinct. So Slow Food is a good place to start.
I think that Brian Ward down at the Coastal Research and Education Center maintains a seed collection for Clemson of heirloom vegetables. If you have something that you suspect is rare, send it there. The Southern Exposure Seed Exchange in Virginia is another great clearinghouse for Southern vegetables. But one of the things you'll find is that if you're on Facebook or on certain social media groups, the interest groups that deal with like Southern beans or Southern cucurbits or Southern corn growers or seed savers, there are numbers of people there. The Southern Fruit Explorers Fellowship is a great group that looks for old pears, old apple varieties, old nut varieties, and they are some of the most active. One of the things that you have to say is with the recent revival of interest in cider, everyone who's producing good quality cider is looking for old Southern cider apples, old limber twigs or Yates apples. So if you have a suspicion that there's an apple tree in your neighborhood that's got an old cider apple on it, there are a lot of people that would be interested in that.
All right. Well, thank you. I think Carolyn is going to hop back in now. And I just want to thank you both so much. It's been a great conversation for me.
That's your Frogmore stew right there.
Man, is anybody else starving right now? I really know I am. I'm so happy it's almost dinner time. That was an amazing discussion. I feel so grateful to be part of it and learn more about the history behind Southern ingredients. We want to thank both Kevin Mitchell and David Shields for sharing their vast knowledge about Southern cuisine and culture. Don't forget to check their book, Taste the State, South Carolina's Signature Foods, Recipes, and Their Stories, available at Richland Library. It can also be purchased at independent bookseller Odd Bird Books, University of South Carolina Press at uscpress.com. I'd also like to thank Eva Moore for moderating tonight's program. And last but not least, everyone out there watching, thank y'all so much for joining us for tonight's program. Don't forget to check out richlandlibrary.com And in the meantime, happy cooking, happy eating, and good night, everybody.
Thank you.